There was no sunrise in Hive Trask. The sun had died centuries ago, choked by soot and orbital fallout, until even the illusion of dawn was buried beneath chemcloud and despair. The hive still stood, barely, like a titanic corpse held together by rust and memory. Its spires had long since crumbled inward, and its underhive had become a maze of forgotten sins, where the administratarm's ink never flowed and the emperor's light barely flickered. Down there, beneath 600 levels of sealed steel and heresy-blackened corridors, the air was thick enough to chew. And in that hunger, in that silence, punctuated only by the whine of dying generators and the coughs of things pretending to be men, something began to move. It started with heat, not warmth. Not the subtle shift of atmosphere one might feel in a functioning Prometheum stack or the control chambers of a manual. This was raw, like flesh peeling from bone beneath a forge's breath, like lungs begging for mercy as every molecule screamed its last hymn. The underhive had known fire before. Gangers with chemflamers, pyrokenes hunted and purged by the Adeptus Arbites. But this was different. The heat remembered. Kieran felt it first. Once a Ganger king, now just a half-starved whisper of what he'd been. He'd carved his name in blood on for hive tears and had worn fingers like trophies once. Now he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything that hadn't moved on its own. But even in his half-delirious haze, he felt it, not on his skin, but in the marrow of his spine, a pulse. Like footsteps. He thought it was the Hab unit's reactor failing again, spiking temp for the 1000th time before sputtering into ice. But no, the heat didn't spread. It approached, like it knew where he was, and with it came the sound, not a footstep. Not really. More like metal dragging across bone, slow and deliberate, punctuated by something deeper. A rhythmic clink, like a censer knocking against a flanged pauldron, or the sway of a Cenobite's relics in a cathedral long abandoned by sanity. Kieran crawled to the nearest wall, pressing against it like it could hide him from something that hadn't even appeared. His hands shook, not from fear, not yet, from memory. He didn't know what the thing was, but something in his blood did. He heard the voice hours later. It didn't speak. It scraped, confess, that was all. No echo, no force. Just a word dragged like iron across the mind, delivered not through vox or flesh but through judgment itself. He confessed, not out of choice, but as if something had reached into him, wrapped burning chains around the blackest part of his soul, and ripped it into the open. He spoke of children drowned in some water, of deals made with scrap-code cults, of how he'd burned a rival alive, laughing just to hear how long it took the lungs to burst. He wept, he bled, and when he finished, the heat passed. He should have died. He wanted to. But when the silence returned, Kieran found himself alone, the wall blackened by soot where something had stood. No footprints, no scorch marks, just the faint smell of ash soaked in guilt. He wasn't the only one by the end of that cycle. 23 souls in lower segmentum delta had vanished, not killed, not gunned down in gang wars or lost to cannibal tribes. They vanished. No screams, no struggle, just ... gone. And in their stead, others were found trembling. Mutants, heretics, a dying preacher who hadn't spoken a word since the plague wars ended. Each found scorched, each babbling, "It rides the fire. It rides the fire. It rides the fire ... The Arbites sent no one. Not because they didn't care, but because no one asked. No vox signals escaped the lower hive anymore. The silence was part of the deal. Those who lived there were already dead. Their deaths simply hadn't been written down yet, but the Adeptus Mechanicus noticed. Not right away. The underhive always sputtered. Always flared and died and flared again. But the Margot's biologist stationed in Orbitary Node 7 was watching for something specific, a pattern buried in Prometheum exhaust vectors. And when her engines sang the wrong frequency, she listened. She saw the flare, not a normal heat bloom. This wasn't plasma or fusion or reactor vent. This was localized combustion that didn't obey gravity. It moved like a predator, stopped, moved again, and always after, the ambient entropy dropped. As if heat had been ... fed. She sent Skittery to investigate. They did not return. 3 days later, a single servitor wandered into one of her cleansing chambers. No legs, Vox grill melted shut. One data slate embedded in its spine. It played only one message, a single rasped word, confess, and behind it, on repeat, the scream of burning flesh that never quite resolved into human pitch. As if what screamed had forgotten how the Magos requested exterminatus. The request was denied, and in Hive Trask, the fire began to climb. Kieran didn't sleep. Not anymore. Not since the rider came. Not since the burning started. Sleep was dangerous. Now not just because of gangers, or hunger, or the things with too many eyes that skittered through the vents, but because dreams no longer belonged to the dreamer. They burned too. Not like memory. Not like guilt. Like judgment. Like something ancient and unmaking watched from within the coils of thought. Waiting for the moment his eyelids fell, to slide fire into the shape of justice and burn the lie from his soul. He stayed in motion. That's what kept you alive in Trask. Movement, silence, and fear sharper than any blade. The rider didn't seem to follow motion. He followed regret, and Trask was full of it, above him. In Hivespire's sectors that hadn't yet collapsed, life still ticked in the bureaucratic shadows. Mid-hive nobles whose titles were inherited from nothing drank Miko wine and issued meaningless decrees about work quotas for manufactura that hadn't functioned in centuries. They didn't know about the fire. Not yet. But the rumors were rising like pressure through the pipes, leaking into their dreams. Carried in the incense breath of dying priests. They would know soon, down in Sublival 910. The gangs of House Tarak had declared a state of war. Not against each other. Against the fire. They didn't understand what it was, but they knew what it wasn't. It wasn't something they could bribe, threaten, or kill. They tried. One gang lord, a wretched brute named Vansk, who wore a throne of server skulls, cornered the rider near a broken tram line with 30 of his best flamers. Chain blades, a repurposed Sentinel Walker rigged for shock assault. None survived. The walker was found a day later, turned inside out. Not broken, reversed. Its armor plates curled outward like petals. The pilot's skull fused to the control stick, mouth still open in a scream that hadn't ended, and the ground bore one word, scorched deep into the steelcrete in curving, ancient High Gothic pennants. Some believed it a psyker, others a daemon host that had escaped binding, but those who had seen it, truly seen it, and somehow lived, knew otherwise. This thing chose who it hunted. It passed by a dying Medicae, who had once saved a child's life, only to rip a Texkov to cinders for cannibalizing an ecclesiarch's bones That was what scared people most. It knew Kieran tried to leave. Tried to reach level 480, where the air was cleaner, where people didn't remember names like his. But the lifts were dead, and the ascent ladders had melted. Not like fire, like judgment. He found others, eventually. Survivors, not of fire, but of guilt. A former scholar instructor whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. A data slave who'd once erased a cogboy's mind on a dare. An old woman who'd lived 300 years, trading in black market corpse starch. They didn't speak. Not at first. Then came the voice again, not from outside. From within, confess. The data slave screamed until his tongue turned to ash. The old woman whispered names, thousands of them, all the ones she'd starved. The instructor begged forgiveness from the Emperor, tears boiling in the corners of his eyes, and the fire came. Not from walls or ceiling, from inside them. It was not flame as man understood it, not plasma or gas. It was something deeper, older, as if the sin itself had become flammable, and now burned as fuel for something hungry. The instructor vanished in a bloom of light. The data slave melted. The old woman remained. Kieran didn't know why. He didn't ask. She turned to him, her voice no longer hers, hollow and rimmed in flame, but somehow kind. He's not here for you yet, but you will walk his road. Then she fell silent, and when Kieran touched her shoulder, she turned to cinders in his hand, above them, for the first time in decades. A storm of ash rained down from the broken vents of Hive Trask. Not industrial fallout, not rust-bone dust, and in its drift, a whisper carried through the hive like incense through a cathedral. He burns for the Emperor, but not in his name. The ash did not settle. It never did, not truly. It hung in the air like guilt made manifest, clinging to skin and soul alike, coating every breath with the taste of old graves and forgotten crimes. In Hive Trask, the air was already poison, a blend of leaking promethium fumes, recycled decay, and half-functioning air scrubbers wheezing out prayers more often than oxygen. But now, the ash carried intention. It wasn't just residue. It was memory, burned and shed. A record of judgment rendered. Kieran could no longer tell if he was awake or alive. He wandered between levels now, too deep for sunlight, too shallow for silence. The corridors were lined with rusted aquilay and saint statues, whose faces had been melted blank by time and neglect. Where once sermons had been sung by vox-hailers and incense swung from steel rafters in penitent arcs, now only the occasional drip of chemical condensation broke the silence. A slow, viscous sound, like the hive itself was bleeding from its forgotten wounds. But it was the walls that haunted him most. They moved. Not physically, but remembered. He could feel it, the tension, the weight of a million whispered confessions echoing through ancient ductwork, through prayer-etched bulkheads and graffiti-layered support pillars. There were names in those, scratches, prayers, pleas, begging for the rider not to come, but he did. Always the stories traveled, faster than truth. On level 771, told of a child who had been caught. Stealing from a corpse, a common enough crime, rarely punished in Trask, but when the child returned to her habs, she was found sitting perfectly still, eyes scorched black, whispering. He saw me, over and over again, until her lungs burst into flame and the words melted from her throat. A preacher on level 643 had declared the writer a saint, claimed the flames were holy, that the fire did not consume, it purified, that the emperor had sent him not to destroy, but to test. The preacher burned within the hour, but his vox recording remained. In it, before the final screams, he whispered, "I saw the rider's face. It was mine." Kieran didn't know what to believe anymore. He only knew one thing. The rider didn't kill without reason. He waited. He watched, and when the fire came, it came because you deserved it. The hive was unraveling. Not just physically, that had been happening for centuries, but something deeper. A psychic unraveling. Faith and fear twisted together until the two became indistinguishable. No one trusted anyone anymore. People confessed at random, not to priests, but to walls, to machines, to each other. Some carved their sins into their flesh with bits of broken pipe. Others dragged the bodies of their friends into the open and screamed their crimes at the void, hoping the fire would pass them by. Sometimes. It did, sometimes. It did, and through it all, Kieran walked, not because he was brave. He wasn't. Not because he had nothing to hide. He had everything to hide. But because the rider hadn't come for him, not yet. That meant there was still a chance to understand. At the heart of Trask, buried beneath 60 stories of collapsed Habshapoles and rust-slick manufacturing quarries, there was a door. It wasn't marked. It wasn't guarded. But it radiated heat, and not the kind that melted flesh, the kind that judged it. No one opened it. No one ever had. But in the center of that door was an emblem. Not an Aquila, not the cog of Mars. It was a skull, not human, not quite. Crowned in fire, mouth open not in scream, but in sermon. Kieran found it by accident, or perhaps by design. Nothing in Trask was accidental anymore. He stared at the door. For a long time he did not touch it. He only listened, and beneath the groaning pipes and the hum of dying reactors, he heard it breathing, not from within, from behind him. When he turned, there was no one there, only a whisper, soft as ashfall. "You will confess." And somewhere behind the door, the fire smiled. The silence that followed was alive. It breathed in rhythms too precise to be natural, too hollow to be human, like lungs carved from voidstone, exhaling judgment into every crack of Hive Trask's dying bones. Kieran stood frozen before the door, his body locked by a terror that was neither instinct nor fear, but recognition. He had seen executioners, had bled beside commissars and bounty slaves, and even once watched an ever assassin reduce a gang to ruin in a blink of stim-mad fury. But none of them had made him feel like this. This wasn't fear of death. This was fear of being known. He didn't run, because deep down, some part of him, some shard of child Kieran, from before the hunger, before the knives, wanted to be seen, wanted the fire to come, to end the long ache of hiding, of remembering. He almost spoke, but the whisper was gone, so he turned, and left the door behind him. The hive around him had changed. It wasn't visible, not in the decay of architecture or the slow drip of leaky Prometheum mains, but the feel of it had shifted. People were no longer hiding. They were waiting. The stories of the rider had transcended rumor. He had become inevitable. In level 688, a child set herself alight in mimicry, whispering sins she could not possibly have committed. In level 522, a corpse handler began painting murals of a flaming skull across the walls of a corpse processing plant. Not with pigment, with blood. The rider had never spoken to either of them. It didn't matter. Cults had formed, not of worship, but of confession. Not ecclesiastical, not sanctioned, but desperate. Groups gathered in abandoned habs to take turns dragging their secrets into the light. Some wept, some screamed, some flayed their own skin with cogitator shards and wrote their sins on the walls in a script only madness could read. They did it to survive, and it worked for some. Kieran watched one of these gatherings in silence, perched above a rusted walkway in a long-dead arboretum where nothing had grown since the age of apostasy. 27 of them sat in a circle, lit by the guttering flame of a stolen chem lamp. They passed a broken vox grill from hand to hand like a relic, each speaking their truth into its silence. One confessed to sabotaging rations during a gang war. Another had killed her brother for a meal. Another had led an entire family into an ambush for a single stick. The flame of the chem lamp never wavered when they finished. There was no fire, no scream, no rider, just the settling of breath, the ache of admission, the terrifying peace of being heard. Kieran did not speak. He could. Not yet, but he understood. Ryder was not purging the hive. He was waking it, and that meant the fire wasn't coming to end Trask. It was coming to reveal it. He returned to the door 3 cycles later. It was still sealed, still breathing heat like a heart inside the hive's spine. But this time, something had changed. A mark had been carved into the steel, not with tools. With fire, it was a single line of high Gothic, burned so deeply into the metal that it glowed. When the last lie is ash, I will open. Kieran stepped back. He knew then what the rider was. Not a man, not a demon, not a servant of the Emperor. Not exactly. The rider was a mirror, and Trask's time was almost up. The chapter ends, not with flame, but with silence. A silence full of breath, of secrets unsaid, of footsteps that echo without sound. Somewhere above, in spire levels, where the rider's name has only just begun to circulate, a mid-hive noble wakes from a nightmare, clutching a blanket that smolders at the edges. In orbit, the Margot's biologist watches her screens flicker with phrases she did not program, and beneath them all, in a hive that no longer dreams, Kieran walks through Ashdot, not away from the fire, but toward it. The Vox recording repeated itself every 17 seconds, a loop of static and heat-distorted whisper, carved into the back of a mutilated servitor and transmitted through a signal pattern that defied all known encryption. The Margot's biologist did not blink. Her ocular lenses shifted through 5 spectrums as she observed the data stream, not analyzing, not yet witnessing. The Mechanicus did not believe in the divine outside the Omnissiah's machine mind. But even the red-robed tech priests surrounding her lowered their voices. Something was wrong. Confess, the voice said, and then silence. Not just absence of sound, pure silence. As if the Vox itself held its breath, waiting for someone to answer. The Magos had seen strange things in her centuries of flesh-tempered service. Xenotech buried in feral worlds. Warp-spawned echoes pulsing through metal like hauntings. Even once, she had overseen the vivisection of a captured Daemon host, whose blood sang prayers to the Dark Mechanicum. But this, this was different. The rider's flame showed up in no cogitation lexicon, no scrap code, no esoteric binary hex of the lathe worlds. And yet the signal's waveform aligned with sacred machine hymns, used only in the rebuilding of reactor spirits. As if whatever this entity was, It understood not just flesh, but circuit. She watched the servitor twitch. Even now, after being half melted, it pulsed in time with the signal, as though something burned behind its broken optics. Watching her through the damage, she did not flinch. Instead, she uttered the rite of unmaking and dissected it. What she found in the bone was not organic. It was forged. A chain link, impossibly small, woven with filaments of platinum and coated adamant. Impossible to synthesize with any known tech. She examined it for hours. It did not rust, did not bend. It was not part of any known Mechanicus schematic, but it pulsed with heat. Not stored, alive, a piece of the rider. Perhaps, or what bound him. She deployed a full skittery phalanx to Trask. 72 augmented warriors in red and bronze, Mars-forged, pulse-ready, each. Carried heavy phosphor blasters and enough plasma charges to cook a Reaver Titan. Their descent was silent. Their orders were absolute. Locate the source of the anomaly. Retrieve what could be retrieved. Purge all else. They reached level 642. They did not reach level 641. The last image transmitted through their was burned into Mechanicus cogitators across the orbital station. One by one, the skittery stopped moving. Not fell, not destroyed. They stopped, mid-step, mid-blink, mid-dash signal, as if time had refused to carry them forward. Then their vox units flared all at once. The same voice confess, and then heat not from the outside. From within, their augmetics, lenses exploded. Internal cogitators vented smoke like incense burners. The fire ate them from inside their logic. Their screams were not panicked. They were repentant. The Margos wept, not from sadness, not from fear, from awe. The fire understood machine. Not just the corruption of it, not just the punishment of it, but the shame of it. As if the rider did not merely judge the soul, but the code behind it. That night, she walked into her own forged temple and performed the deepest sin a biologist could commit. She unplugged, disconnected, every link to new, turned off her communion with Mars, severed her thought thread from the greater machine choir, and she prayed, not to the omniscience IOH, but to the flame, because something in her circuitry, buried beneath decades of augmentation, beneath layers of logic and metal, believed. The rider was not a virus. He was justice coded in fire and in the cold. Dead orbit above Hive Trask. A Mechanicus priest who had never known fear knelt beside a dead servitor and whispered, "I am ready to confess." The fires on Trask spread, but not as flame dot. No manufacturum burned. No Prometheum tanks burst. The spire lanterns stayed dark, the air unchanged. And yet, level by level, soul by soul, the hive caught fire, not to be destroyed, but to be revealed. The chain was the key. The Margos had ordered it isolated, then replicated. But it defied all attempts. Scanners failed to classify its structure. Auspex readings returned only static. Not the chaos of corruption, but the stillness of a choice. Every time they attempted a scan, the equipment cooled, even while the room grew hotter, and once, for the briefest moment, the chain moved, not by machine impulse or magnetic fluctuation. It tends, as if responding to truth. 3 tech adepts dropped dead when it did. The Magos began to suspect the impossible. This was no mere relic, no weapon. It was a sacrament, not crafted, forged. Every link, an oath. Every length an act of contrition, a judgment spoken and made physical. Not chains of imprisonment, but of burden. The rider didn't carry chains to bind others. He carried them to bear their sins. And someone, something, had taught him how. The Margos dug deep into prescribed texts, into half-burned archives of the Dark Age. She found whispers, not records, not data, stories. A man on fire who could not die. A rider whose chains bore memory, whose every lash burned not flesh, but truth. Sometimes he wore a skull, sometimes a helmet, always alone, always unyielding, always confession before death. There was no designation for him. No Ordo Hereticus label, no Xenos designation, no demon class, only a single code, stamped in faded red over a lost data codex that once belonged to a long-dead Inquisitor, class penitent pattern entity, codename Ghostfire. She leaned back in her data throne, the ashlight of Trask reflected in her lenses. Ghostfire. A legend, a weapon. No, something deeper, a response. The Mechanicus had catalogued 1,000 horrors. Necron, Tyrannid, demon engines forged in the warp. But never this. Never something that felt so old and yet so present. A creature not of chaos, but of order so absolute it burned, and suddenly she understood. The pattern. The rider wasn't hunting the wicked. He was walking a path, a precise sequence through the hive, each death, each revelation, aligning something buried far beneath. A code, a mechanism, a gate, and when the last sin was spoken, the chain would uncoil and open it. She tried to stop him, not out of fear, out of curiosity, but the moment she spoke the words aloud, even within the sealed sanctum of her Vox-free lab, the temperature dropped. Her heart, what was left of it, stuttered, and then her internal cogitator froze, not mechanically, morally. One phrase appeared on every lumen screen around her, typed in the Mechanicus tongue, not by fingers, but by fire. You do not seek truth. You seek control. Her blood boiled, literally. Her coolant system flushed heat so violently her fingers blistered. She collapsed to her knees, smoke rising from the seams of her mechadendrites. Her eyes went dark, but she lived because she had stopped. And in the silence of her blindness, a voice echoed from her own cranial speakers, not synthetic, his, "You are not ready." When her vision returned, the chain was gone, melted into the floor. No trace. She did not search for it again. Instead, she turned all her will, all her mission, toward tracking the rider's path. Not to stop him, not to understand him, but to witness the moment the chain uncoiled and Hive Trask opened. The pattern resolved like a hymn sung in reverse. The rider moved with purpose, never doubling back, never straying. From sublevels soaked in rot to towers draped in false gold, his fire traced a perfect spiral through the hive's layers, burning not randomly but with ritual precision. Each place he passed through bore a wound, not of structure, but of memory. Forgotten war crimes, broken oaths, acts of desperation and betrayal, long buried under layers of duct tape and indifference. He unearthed them all. The Margos mapped them, not just where the rider had gone, but where he would go. She saw it now. Each burn mark, each scorched wall, each vanished soul created a lattice that curved inward toward the hive's heart, not a physical location, but a moral one, a core of guilt, and at its center, the door. Kieran was already there. He did not know why he returned, only that something pulled at him, not with force, but with familiarity, like the ache of an old scar when a storm rolls in. He'd tried to leave, to rise, to vanish into another level, another life, but every path turned him back. Not through threat, through reminder, voices in the vents whispering sins he'd forgotten, mirrors reflecting a face he hadn't seen since before the murders, dreams that ended in chains curling tight around his throat. The door waited, no longer silent, it hummed now, not with electricity, but with breath, and it glowed, not steadily, but with rhythm, like a heart, like a pulse. Kieran approached. His body ached, not with pain, but with weight, as if everything he'd ever done, everything he'd refused to admit, was being dragged behind him now, woven into invisible chains that scraped along the floor. As he walked, he reached the threshold. The mark was gone. In its place, a keyhole, shaped not like any mechanism, but like a link, a chain link, the same as the one the Mogos had failed to replicate. Kieran looked down, and for the first time, saw the truth. He had always carried it around his wrist, under his skin, a scar that had never healed right, not from battle, but from binding. He reached up and touched the door, not with hand, with memory, and it opened. There was no sound, no rush of flame, no burst of heat, only a single breath, his own, drawn in sharply, as if the hive itself had just inhaled, and inside, chains, miles of them, hanging from the ceiling, rooted in the floor, weaving through machines long dead and bones too large to be human. Each chain glowed faintly, not with fire, but with confession, their links etched with sins in languages no longer spoken. And at the center stood the rider, not a man, not now, perhaps not ever. His skull was flame, but not burning. His cloak hung in rags, but did not move. His hands, bone and shadow, held the chain Kieran had seen in dreams, 1,000 sins long, coiled like a serpent of light and guilt. The rider turned, no words, just a tilt of the head, and Kieran understood. This was not the end, this was the beginning. A chain must be passed, burden must be shared, and in that moment, Kieran saw the future, a hive not purged, but transformed, not by death, but by memory, by fire that does not kill, but judges, and chains, not made of metal, but of truth. He stepped forward. The rider reached out, and the chain moved. Far from Trask, on the edge of a sector left off most modern star charts, a signal repeated across dead channels. It did not broadcast through the warp, nor ripple across the noosphere. It wasn't even particularly loud, yet it cut through debris fields, scraped across derelict void stations, and pinged against Allspec's arrays that should have long ago shut down from entropy. The Adeptus Mechanicus believed such phenomena to be the lingering song of failing, machine spirits, sonic echoes of wars long ended. Others, more superstitious, whispered that it was the language of the dead. But to those who still listened, and there were always listeners, it was something else entirely. It was confession, not spoken, not transmitted, lived, at listening station Solus 9, a half-buried cogitator in an observatory forgotten since the heresy suddenly powered on. No hands touched it. No command activated its spirit. The monitor flared once, briefly, then displayed a single phrase in Gothic script. The chain burns bright. 3 seconds later, every data recorder in the facility ignited. Not with promethium, with internal contradiction. The machine spirits rejected their silence. They turned their own circuits to ash. Only the phrase remained. The Inquisition heard of it within days. Ordo Hereticus agents dispatched a kill team to investigate, expecting taint. Hoping, perhaps, for demonic activity they could catalogue and contain. They did not return, only a servitor walking calmly across the void, its joints hissing but unburned, its eyes blind but focused. It bore no message, no data, just a smell, ash, blood, and something older. One of the Inquisitors, a lean woman whose robes bore no insignia, recognized it. GHOS 5. She had read the Black Vault reports, the old records, the ones scribbled in madness by sequestered psychers whose eyes had burned from their skulls after saying too much. She'd dismissed them once, no longer, because the dreams had started her own. They came wrapped in chains, not nightmares, memories, not hers, in them. She walked through cathedrals made of bone, cathedrals that wept oil, where saints were not canonized but confessed into being. The stained glass showed no emperor, only the rider, faceless, nameless, inevitable. In each dream, she carried a chain. It grew heavier each night. She began to question things she hadn't dared to question in decades. Not laws, not rituals, motives. She turned inward, began to examine her own memories. Not heretics she'd executed, but those she hadn't. Not confessions extracted, but those ignored she couldn't stop. The dreams changed now. She walked a hive.trask, though she had never been there. She knew it, felt it in the way one recognizes their own reflection. The decay, the desperation, the way sin soaked the steel like oil in cloth. She watched fire walk its halls and felt neither fear nor disgust, only recognition. One night, she did not dream. She woke into the vision. The air stank of guilt. Not metaphor, actual stench, thick and oily, crawling through her Chains rattled in the distance. She followed them, not by sound, by instinct. Her steps echoed, not in stone, but in remembrance. And then she stood before him, the rider. He did not speak. Not this time. He only raised a hand, and the flame touched her. Not to burn, to show. She saw planets she'd never visited, and the sins committed there. Saw lies told in the name of faith. Innocence crushed beneath the tread of machinery meant to preserve purity. She saw herself, again and again, raising a bolt pistol in judgment without ever listening, and she wept, because she had believed. Still, believed, but now she understood. Faith was not meant to silence truth. It was meant to survive. It, the rider, vanished. She awoke in her quarters. The air was cold. Her bolt pistol was missing in its place. Resting gently on her altar was a single chain link. Still warm, she did not report it. She simply stood and whispered, "I am ready to begin." The bones whispered, not in words, in weight. In the ache of stones grown heavy with memory. In the brittle hum of ossified cathedrals abandoned by time and the ecclesiarchy alike. Beneath Hive Trask, deeper than any servitor had ever plumbed. Deeper even than the black cells of the Inquisition's rumored sublairs. There were vaults built not to contain treasure, but guilt. Places where sins too great for parchment were buried in silence. where the past was not merely hidden, it was bound. This was where the rider walked now. The chains had brought him here, not carried, guided. Each link a judgment, each weight a direction, downward, inward, toward the rot behind the rust. He did not rush. There was no need. Time did not matter in this place. The hive's pulse slowed here, like the heart of a dying god. Kieran followed, though he could no longer say why. He did not speak. His mouth was dry, as if his body feared to interrupt the rhythm of chains against stone. Each step they took unraveled something in him. Not his flesh, not his sanity, but his armor. The parts he'd built to survive. The lies he'd told himself to keep breathing. They passed statues, not of saints, not of martyrs, but of men. Ordinary figures, some weeping, some with mouths agape in silent screams, others kneeling with chains coiled lovingly around their throats. The plaques were long since scorched, yet the message remained. Confession is the flame that sets you free. At the vault center, they found the bones laid out in a perfect circle, thousands of them, not ossuaries, not graves. These were arranged, constructed like cogitator arrays, each rib and skull aligned like logic gates in a machine of guilt. And at its heart, a dais of polished black iron. Upon it, a book, open, blank. Kieran stepped forward, drawn not by curiosity, but by compulsion. The rider stood still, silent, fire flickering gently in his hollowed skull. No judgment. Not yet. Kieran looked down at the book, and it spoke. Not aloud in him. Words carved themselves into the page, one after another, not by pen, but by memory. His memory. Not just his crimes, his reasons. The first lie he'd told to protect his gang brother. The first death. The first silence that killed as surely as any blade. The betrayal, the fear, the laughter he faked when he let the child die. The page drank it all. The book did not weigh, more Kieran did. He collapsed, but the rider caught him, not gently, not cruelly, simply present, and the chains shifted. One link snapped free from the rider's coil and wrapped itself around Kieran's wrist. He gasped, not from pain, but from clarity. The weight wasn't punishment, it was reminder. He had confessed, and the fire had accepted. The bones shifted, all around them. The vault hummed. Chains vibrated. Dust trembled. The statues wept ash. And above, far above, Trask began to hear it. Dreams changed. People didn't just fear the rider now. They felt him in their breath, in their blood, in the moments between blinks. The flame no longer crept through halls. It waited patient, like a church before the bell. The Mechanicus wept binary tears as cogitators began writing their own scenes into data tapes and then igniting them. Redemptionist priest in the upper hive burst into flame in the middle of a sermon, screaming his mother's name, and a single orphan, blind since birth, looked up at the hive's decaying sky and whispered, "He's not alone anymore," because Kieran had taken the chain, and somewhere far beyond Trask, far from Sector Cumi or the grasp of the Inquisition, others woke to fire. Asterisk, the fire spread without flame, across star systems and void lanes, beneath the crust of long-dead forge worlds and deep within shrines that had forgotten their saints. The chain began to echo, no longer singular, no longer bound to one soul, one sin, one path. It moved in fragments, not broken, but shared, passed not as weaponry, but as burden. a weight to be chosen, a penance to be shouldered, and so the rider vanished. Not in death, in transmission. Kieran remained behind, but not as himself. Not entirely. The man who had walked beneath Hive Trask with blood beneath his nails and silence in his lungs had been unmade. In his place stood a figure no longer bent by guilt, no longer hiding behind old scars. He did not carry fire in his eyes, nor flame in his breath, but the chain still clung to his wrist, and it knew he did not walk like the rider, he walked like himself, and still the sin recoiled, not out of fear, out of recognition. The vault beneath Trask cracked, not with explosion, but with light. The bones of the forgotten saints, if they had ever been saints at all, shimmered and crumbled into dust. The book, now heavy with truth, burned, not to vanish, to rise. Its pages turned into smoke and scattered upward. Like prayers to honest for the ecclesiarchy's lips, the hive groaned, and something opened. Not a gate, not a rift, a path. No one saw Kieran leave. No service skull recorded him. No vox picked up his signal. But 3 days later, on the world of Seraphix, a shrine world lost during the Great Rift's birth, a pilgrim burst into flame at the foot of a broken Aquila. He did not scream, he spoke. I have sinned. I do not ask for mercy, I ask for memory. Then he fell to Ashdod, and in the crowd, a man with a chain on his wrist walked away, unseen. Far above, in inquisitorial strongholds built on silence and fear, alarms flared, not red. White. The old warning, the one that had no siren, only a single word flashing across every data slate and purity seal. Unbound. The rider had not ended. He had begun, and in vaults sealed since the age of apostasy. The bones of other saints who had never been canonized, stirred not. With life, with memory. They remembered fire, they remembered chains, and they remembered the whisper that came before everything ended. Confess. There are whispers in the golden throne, not from the emperor, from beneath him, within the vast, unfathomable chambers that house the throne mechanicum, a place no unaugmented human may survive for more than seconds. The custodians have long claimed there is nothing but silence, nothing but the pulse of immortal machinery and the deep, endless breath of the master of mankind as he dreams in fire and code. But that is no longer entirely true. Some who walk the throne's periphery, the silent lexma, the ordo sinister adepts, granted a single glimpse of eternity, have begun to pause. Just for a moment. In the long, golden dark, where even light bows in reverence, they hear something new, a rattle, a chain, dots soft, subtle, but unmistakable. They do not speak of it. There are no reports filed, no data slates marked. Some believe it to be a hallucination, a psychic echo from the countless minds whose souls burn out each day, feeding the astral. Others think it the last prayers of dying navigators, but in one cloistered hall, deep within the custody's own vaults, one warrior stands longer now. He does not turn toward the throne, he turns away, toward the darkness. At the edge, the place where judgment waits, because the fire is not coming to destroy, it is coming to question. Across the Imperium, things begin to fray, but not from chaos, from truth. In redemptionist enclaves, on Varela Secundus, sermons are interrupted by screams, not of pain, of memory. Entire congregations collapse into spasms of confession, screaming names, crimes, old lies, before bursting into tears and silence in the black ships. Psychers begin speaking in unison, not tongues, not madness. They speak names. Names no one remembers, but when recorded and played back, every syllable glows faintly red dot, as if the fire remembers, in a schola on sibilant V. A child draws a skull in flame on the wall using only her fingers and ash. She does not know what it is. She has never seen the rider. She does not understand the chains. But she writes one sentence perfectly in High Gothic. Despite never being taught the language, he burns in waiting. And on every forge world, on every minor moon or decrepit station where machine spirits still sing their binary prayers, strange errors appear. Not catastrophic, not demonic, just ... corrections. Tithing codes adjusted to reflect forgotten. Casualties. Cargo manifests rewritten to include the dead. Twitch and weep ash. No one knows why, except perhaps the Inquisition, but they are divided. Some, like the Hereticus Inquisitor who woke to a chain on her altar, believed this to be a revelation, a final test, proof that the Emperor still watches or that he has passed. Judgment. Others believe it is a threat, that something is waking in the cracks of the Imperium, something that cannot be silenced, because it is made not of heresy, but of truth too long hidden, and the Ordo Malleus. They do not speak at all, because they know they've seen him before, not always with a skull of flame. Sometimes, in the dreams of those possessed, in the final screams of banished warp things, there is a figure, alone, burning, not with warp energy, not with demonic ICHOR, with conscience, a concept foreign to the eye of Terra, a sickness, a plague, one that the great enemy cannot touch, remorse, and now it walks the galaxy again, unbound. Somewhere in the halo stars, where the Astronomicon flickers and the warp gapes wide like an open wound, a ship floats dead in the void. It is not adrift, it is waiting. Its hull bears no insignia. Its Vox transmissions are mute, yet its engines glow faintly, not with power, but with memory. Across its shattered bridge, its command throne sits empty, save for a single chain, coiled across its arm like a sleeping serpent. It hasn't moved in decades until now. In the silence, a whisper unfurls, not across comes, not through warp-echo. Through souls. Every astropath within 10 light years begins to scream, not in pain, in recognition. They speak in one voice, like a choir that never rehearsed and yet knows the hymn by heart. He waits, he remembers, he judges, and on the bridge of the dead ship, the chain shifts. Back in Hive Trask, the vault has closed. Kiran is gone. Those who remained in the hive do not speak of him, not out of fear, but reverence. The hive did not collapse. It did not burn. It simply ... changed. Silence has replaced chaos. Not peace, awareness. The kind that makes even the lowest dreg check their own thoughts before acting. Makes former gangers weep in empty corridors without knowing why. The fire no longer walks. It settled, and still, it spreads. The ecclesiarchy, ever desperate to seize narrative, begins to weave the rider into their sermons. They call him a saint now, Saint Ignatius the Redeemer, or Saint Flameborn, depending on which hive world. Preachers scream loudest, but the people do not listen, because those who feel the rider know. Better he is no saint. Saints die, saints forgive. He remembers. Even the Astartes begin to notice. On the frozen battlegrounds of Bracken 7, a squad of iron hands discover a warband of word-bearers burned to ash, not by LAS or Bolter, but something ... older. Their armor is intact. Their flesh is gone, and in the snow a chain is drawn in soot. Not a symbol, a path. The Tech Marines are disturbed, not by the destruction, by the precision. The rider knows sin, not by DNA, not by bloodline, but by intent. And what then of the Emperor? The fire spreads to Terra, not in flame. In questions. The Adeptus Custodes never admit what they see, not to each other, not to their Jinkin, but one among them, golden and still as a statue, watches the throne and sees a flicker, just once, a curl of heat in the air, not from the Aest throne of from the wound beneath it, and in that moment, he feels something that does not belong in the throne hall, not reverence, not awe, dread. The fire is not here to destroy the Imperium, it is here to ask it a question, and the Imperium, bloated, blind, full of rot, masquerading as tradition, is not ready to answer. But it must, because the fire waits, and it never goes out. Somewhere in the long dark between stars, where light travels too slow to matter and time itself forgets to tick, the fire pauses, not because it tires, because it remembers. The rider stands alone in a cathedral without walls, not in space, not in warp, but in the place between. A memory forged so powerfully into the fabric of reality it has become real again. The chains drift around him, weightless, humming like psalms torn from dying throats. His skull does not burn now. It glows steady, soft, as if morning. Before him lies a single figure, kneeling, clad in ceramite, warped by shame and time and Astartes, or what was once one, still bearing the seal of the Emperor's children, scraped raw until only blood remains. He speaks without moving his mouth. I thought I would escape you. The rider does not reply. There is no need, the chain answers. One link falls. From the sky, it lands with no sound. But the screams. Not from pain, from truth. And then, silence, when the screaming stops. There is no body, only understanding. The fire consumes what is, unspoken, and leaves behind only the truth. Not every link is forged in sin. Some are forged in regret, some in hope. The rider turns, slowly, and the cathedral fades. He walks again, but now he is not the only one. Somewhere in the segmentum, a missionary lays down his staff and walks into the ocean, murmuring scenes to the waves until the tide turns to steam. On a forge world near Ultima Thule, Imago surrenders her augmetics one by one, each time speaking a word of apology not to Mars, but to herself. And in a penal colony built atop a dying sun, the prisoners riot not in rebellion, but in revelation. They drag their jailers into the light and force them to confess, not to crimes of war, but to crimes of silence. No fire, no unchanged, just truth. The fire waits, not because it must, because it chooses. 2. Because it is not a purge. It is an invitation, confession, not as weakness, but as weapon. And in the heart of the void, where even demons dare not tread, a whisper curls through the warp. The great enemy hears it, and recoils, because this flame is not theirs. It is mortal, it is pure. and it does not ask for belief. It knows. A final link drops from the sky. The rider catches it without moving. The chain is almost complete, and when it is, there will be no firestorm, no apocalypse, only a question. 1. That no emperor, no Xenos god, no demon prince can ever escape. A whisper of flame that burns at the base of every soul. No matter how deeply buried, what did you hide? And in that question lies the future, because only those who can answer it fully, freely, will walk forward, not into salvation, into truth. The rider does not stop. He never did. He only waits.